Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're venturing into something, well, really central to modern life, how social media is reshaping the emotional landscape of our relationships. It's
Mhm.
kind of incredible how these platforms have just become so intertwined with, our intimate connections.
It really is a fundamental shift.
Yeah.
Social media isn't just a tool we use anymore, is it? It's actually altering the very fabric of how we experience and manage our emotions within our closest bonds.
Yeah.
We're basically navigating entirely new ways of expressing ourselves and understanding each other emotionally in this digital sphere.
Okay, so let's really get into this then. We know relationships have always been emotionally rich, sometimes, challenging,
Yeah,
right?
always.
But now we've layered these online worlds on top. So how does social media actually work as this intermediary for our feelings and relationships?
Well, what's fascinating here is how these platforms mediate our emotional experiences. You can think of them as these virtual environments where our emotions aren't just displayed, they're actually being actively shaped by the design, the features of these spaces.
Shaped by the design. How so?
Well, we see a really stark contrast when we look at private communication, like, say, direct messages on WhatsApp or maybe a FaceTime call. Those tend to facilitate more controlled, intimate emotional exchanges.
Right, those feel more like digital echoes of a private conversation where you feel like you have more direct control over the back and forth.
Exactly. But then you step onto the more public platforms like Facebook or Instagram.
Mm.
And here, the sheer volume of information, the constant stream of updates, plus the inherent nature of social comparison, it can lead to a kind of emotional deluge, you know.
Yeah, overload.
Right. You're continually exposed to these, well, carefully selected highlights from other people's lives, which can definitely trigger a complex range of emotions within the context of your own relationships.
Hmm.
Maybe that feeling of missing out or questioning your own connection.
So it's not just about what we consciously share, but also the constant influx of info and the very architecture of these platforms that's subtly influencing our emotional state within our relationships. Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. How does this play out specifically in our romantic partnerships? Because that's often where the most intense, complex emotions come into play.
Yeah. Zooming in on romantic relationships,
Hmm.
one of those significant impacts we see is the amplification of jealousy
Hmm.
and the normalization of what you might call digital surveillance.
Digital surveillance.
Oh.
Okay.
Social media offers this, well, unprecedented level of access to a partner's social interactions. You can see their friends list, who's liking or commenting on their stuff, who they're tagging or being tagged by.
All the little details.
Exactly. It creates an environment where monitoring a partner's online activity becomes remarkably easy and maybe, unfortunately, increasingly commonplace.
And it almost feels like the platforms are subtly encouraging this sometimes, doesn't it? You get notifications about new friends or likes, little digital breadcrumbs that can inadvertently fuel insecurity, even if there's no real cause for concern.
Precisely. And the research consistently links this kind of online monitoring to increased distrust and a decline in relationship satisfaction.
That makes sense.
Even completely innocuous online interactions alike from an old friend, whatever, can be misinterpreted and perceived as a potential threat. This has led to this concept of digital jealousy, which isn't just about the information itself, but also about how the act of monitoring can drive controlling behaviors and really erode that sense of emotional autonomy in the relationship.
That's a really powerful point. The very act of trying to gain security through checking up can paradoxically breed more insecurity.
No.
Okay, so what about the impact on the actual closeness, the commitment within a relationship when social media is just always there?
Yeah, this raises a really crucial question about how social media can disrupt the more traditional dynamics of intimacy. We see the rise of something called technoference. Yes,
Technoferous.
basically where our engagement with online platforms frequently interrupts our face-to-face interactions with our partners.
Hmm.
Think about trying to have a meaningful conversation when one or both of you are constantly glancing down at your phones.
Oh, absolutely. That feeling of being only partially present with someone because their attention is split, it's elsewhere online.
Exactly. And this constant connectivity can create a real tension between, say, the idealized perceptions of the relationship, maybe what's presented online, and the lived reality of being constantly tethered to the digital world.
Right.
And what's more, studies suggest that for individuals who might have a tendency towards neuroticism,
Hmm.
increased engagement with platforms like Facebook can actually exacerbate negative emotions. It can even contribute to addictive patterns of use, which, naturally takes a toll on the strength and health of the relationship.
So it becomes this complex force.
It really does. Capable of both connecting people and creating distance, which certainly complicates how we manage our emotions together.
It's almost like we're navigating two parallel realities, the one we share directly face to face, and this curated one we present and observe online. Now, you mentioned more coercive context earlier. How does social media factor into abusive relationships? That feels like a really critical area we need to address.
Sadly, yes. Social media can absolutely be perverted into a tool within abusive relationships. These digital platforms can facilitate what's known as technology-facilitated coercive control.
Technology-facilitated coercive control.
Yeah. Abusers can exploit these platforms to relentlessly monitor their partners, intimidate them through digital messages, or even publicly humiliate them. The public nature of many of these platforms can take what were once private conflicts and just amplify them, turning them into public displays designed purely to exert further control and inflict greater emotional distress. The consequences of this kind of digital surveillance and abusive contexts are, frankly, devastating and highlight a very dark side of our hyperconnected world.
That's a chilling reminder of the potential for real harm. Shifting gears a bit, let's talk about how we present ourselves online. You mentioned platform affordances and emotional disclosure. How do the specific features and designs of different platforms shape what we feel comfortable sharing emotionally?
Yeah, this is fascinating. It's about how different social media platforms, through their very design, what researchers call their affordances, cultivate their own unique norms around emotional expression.
Okay.
So if you look at private messaging apps like WhatsApp, the communication tends to feel more immediate, more informal, kind of allows for a freer expression of both positive and negative emotions, usually within a relatively safe and intimate digital space.
Right. It feels more like a direct conversation, less like you're putting on a show for a wider audience.
Precisely. Now contrast that with public platforms like, say, Twitter or Instagram. The norms there often skew towards a more curated and often, let's be honest, predominantly positive self-presentation.
The highlight reel effect.
Exactly. People tend to share what they want their broader network to see, which often involves filtering out negativity or vulnerability. These platform-specific norms essentially dictate what emotions are seen as acceptable for public consumption, and that significantly influences the delicate balance we all try to strike between being authentic and adhering to perceived social expectations.
So it's like we instinctively put on different emotional masks depending on the digital room we're in. And this leads directly to self-presentation and impression management, right? How does this constant curating affect our emotional control, especially within our relationships?
Well, the act of carefully crafting our online profiles to project a desired image becomes a really significant aspect of how we engage with social media. We're constantly, consciously or unconsciously, regulating our emotional responses and deciding the level of personal information we share based on the image we want to convey. Now, this hyper-curation, as some call it, can unfortunately create a lot of pressure to live up to often unrealistic, idealized standards. Seeing that constant stream of curated highlight reels from others can easily trigger feelings of inadequacy. It fosters social comparisons that can destabilize our emotional self-control, not just individually, but also within the dynamics of our relationships.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So this ongoing negotiation between our public portrayal and our private emotional experiences creates a very complex landscape for emotional regulation.
It's like we're all engaged in this subtle performance, and that constant effort must be emotionally draining. Now let's think about different age groups. You mentioned earlier that adolescents are particularly affected by these dynamics. Why is that the case? What makes it different for them?
Well, adolescence is just a uniquely sensitive developmental period, isn't it? Peer relationships and forming your identity are incredibly important.
Absolutely central.
Right. So the pervasive presence of social media during these formative years can really amplify feelings of loneliness, intensify social comparison, and heighten any existing insecurities. Adolescents are also often more prone to engaging in digital monitoring behaviors, things like sharing passwords or obsessively checking read receipts on messages.
Why do they do that? Is it about control?
Often, yes. It's frequently a way to seek reassurance and manage anxieties within their social circles. They're trying to establish some sense of control and security in their often complex social world.
Okay, trying to get a handle on things.
Exactly. But the real irony here is that while these behaviors are often motivated by a desire to assert control and maybe alleviate relational insecurity, they can paradoxically end up eroding trust. They create an atmosphere of suspicion and sometimes unhealthy dependence.
That's a really interesting paradox. What about how different social and cultural norms, particularly around gender, might shape how we express and control our emotions online? Does that play a role?
Oh, absolutely. This is a critical dimension to consider. Research suggests that societal expectations around emotional expression can vary significantly based on both gender and cultural background.
How so?
Well, for instance, while women are often socialized to be more openly emotionally expressive in some contexts, they might also feel a greater pressure on public social media platforms to suppress negative emotions. They might do this to conform to perceived expectations of positivity or, to avoid negative social judgments.
Right, fitting a certain mold.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So understanding how these deeply ingrained social norms intersect with our digital practices is really essential for a nuanced understanding of how social media influences emotional control within our relationships. It's not the same for everyone.
So the impact isn't uniform at all. There's a real interplay of individual factors, social norms, cultural background. You've highlighted how social media can be both beneficial and detrimental. Can we dig a little deeper into that dual nature? It seems important.
Absolutely. It's crucial to hold both sides in mind. On one hand, social media provides these, well, unprecedented opportunities for maintaining connections across geographical distances. It can foster intimacy through continuous communication. Think about long-distance relationships or just staying connected with loved ones throughout busy days. It can be a vital tool.
Yeah, definitely keeps people linked.
But as we've discussed, this constant connectivity also brings with it the challenges of public scrutiny, the pressure to curate that idealized self-image, and the potential for those comparisons that can negatively impact our emotional well-being and really put a strain on our relationships.
It's almost like we're in a constant state of being potentially observed and evaluated online, and that can't help but shape how we interact and how we feel about those interactions, right?
Pres-
Okay, let's revisit the mechanisms of control for a moment. You mentioned earlier that digital surveillance can sometimes be framed, maybe even internally, as an act of caring. Could you elaborate on the nuances of that? Because that sounds tricky.
It is tricky, and it's a really subtle but important point to grasp. Monitoring a partner's digital activity can sometimes be rationalized, either consciously or maybe subconsciously, as an expression of care or investment in their life. Thoughts like, oh, I just want to make sure they're okay, or I'm just curious about what they're up to.
Yeah, plausible deniability almost.
Kind of. It can mask a more controlling impulse.
Acha.
But the boundary between genuine interest and intrusive surveillance is often really blurry. And when that line is crossed, it can rapidly erode trust. What might begin as seemingly innocent checking can quickly escalate into a cycle of suspicion and conflict, even if there's no actual wrongdoing.
Hmm.
The very act of surveillance itself can communicate a fundamental lack of trust, which, unfortunately, can sometimes become a self-fulfilling prophecy within the relationship.
And as you pointed out, the design of these platforms often includes features that seem to inadvertently facilitate this kind of digital creeping, as people call it.
Precisely. Think about the way platforms like Facebook archive years of past activity. You can easily delve into someone's history. Or the public nature of comment sections on platforms like Instagram, where you can readily see a record of interactions back and forth.
Right, it's all there.
Even the supposed ephemerality of platforms like Snapchat doesn't always prevent screenshots, or just the constant checking of who someone is snapping with most often. These platform-specific features create a digital environment that can easily be used for information gathering, which, as we've discussed, can fuel jealousy and suspicion, potentially lead to boundary violations, and ultimately foster a climate of mistrust and instability within a relationship.
So the very architecture of these digital spaces plays a significant role in shaping these relational behaviors, not just our individual choices. Okay, let's shift slightly and consider how the norms of digital communication themselves influence our own ability to regulate our emotions. How does that work?
Well, the prevailing norms on each platform exert a considerable influence on how we manage our emotions online.
Hmm.
Private messaging spaces, like we said, often provide a safer context for more authentic emotional expression. We might feel more comfortable being vulnerable or candid there.
Sure, it feels contained.
Right. However, on more public platforms, there's often this implicit pressure to self-censor, to present a particular image to a broader audience. And that can create a real disconnect between our internal emotional state and what we actually choose to reveal to the world.
Hmm.
This inherent tension between our genuine need for self-disclosure and connection And our desire for positive self-presentation can lead to what psychologists sometimes refer to as affective forecasting errors.
Effective forecasting errors. What are those?
It's basically where we misjudge how sharing or maybe withholding certain information will actually make us feel in the long run. We think sharing something vulnerable will make us feel worse, or hiding something will make us feel better, but we might be wrong.
Ah, okay. It's like we're constantly calculating the potential emotional fallout of what we post or share online.
Exactly. And the unwritten rules of each platform regarding what constitutes acceptable emotional content further shape how and how frequently we choose to self-disclose. Think about the rapid-fire nature of interactions on Twitter versus maybe more asynchronous, potentially more supportive interactions on WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger. They offer different kinds of space for emotional regulation.
Different speeds, different expectations.
Right. Ultimately, the design and features of these platforms play a crucial role in our ability to effectively manage our emotions in the digital realm, which in turn significantly influences our satisfaction within our relationships.
It's also intricately connected. And it makes perfect sense that our individual personality traits would also play a significant role in how we navigate this whole digital emotional landscape.
Oh, absolutely. Our individual personality differences are a key mediating factor. Research consistently shows that individuals who score higher in neuroticism, for instance,
Right, you mentioned that earlier.
yes, they tend to be more vulnerable to the negative emotional consequences of online interactions. They might experience more intense and prolonged negative feelings after scrolling through social media, for example.
Okay.
And they may be more likely to use these platforms as a kind of maladaptive coping mechanism when feeling distressed, even though, paradoxically, this often exacerbates their negative emotions.
So it becomes a negative cycle.
Exactly. A really unhealthy cycle where excessive social media use actually worsens anxiety and emotional dysregulation, which, as we've discussed, can have really detrimental effects on their relationships and their ability to manage emotions within them.
So for some individuals, social media can act almost like an emotional amplifier, intensifying pre-existing vulnerabilities.
Okay, now, given all of this complexity and potential pitfalls, what practical steps can we take? Are there specific strategies or interventions that can help us regain a greater sense of emotional control in this increasingly digital age?
Yeah, thankfully there's a growing awareness of the need for proactive strategies to help us navigate these complex dynamics. One crucial step is promoting greater digital literacy.
Digital literacy,
Yeah.
just understanding it better.
Yes, helping individuals develop a deeper understanding of how online behaviors can impact their emotional well-being and their relationships. It's also really vital to encourage the establishment of clear boundaries, almost a form of digital netiquette, if you will, within relationships regarding social media usage.
Okay, like ground rules.
Exactly. This could involve openly discussing and agreeing on things like, when is it appropriate to be on our phones when we're spending quality time together? Or what level of online sharing about the relationship feels comfortable for both partners? So basically setting some shared digital expectations for the relationship.
Precisely. And beyond establishing those external boundaries, interventions that focus on strengthening our internal self-regulation skills can be really beneficial.
Like what?
Things like practicing mindfulness, cultivating greater self-awareness. These can be particularly helpful in counteracting compulsive social media use. By becoming more attuned to our emotional triggers, what makes us reach for the phone, what kind of content affects us in our habitual online behaviors, we can begin to make more conscious and intentional choices about how we engage.
Right. Less reactive, more intentional.
Exactly. This proactive approach involves not only modifying our behavior, but also maybe reframing how we interpret and process the relational information we encounter online, ultimately leading to improved emotional control.
That makes a lot of sense, cultivating a more mindful and intentional approach to our digital interactions. Okay, finally, let's just touch upon the global perspective again. You mentioned that the impact of social media on emotional control can differ across cultures. Could you give us some specific examples of how that might manifest?
Yeah, this is a really important point to emphasize again. The way social media influences emotional control in relationships is definitely not a universal phenomenon. It's significantly shaped by cultural norms and societal expectations.
Okay.
So, for example, in some cultures, public declarations of a romantic relationship on social media, like changing your relationship status or posting frequent couple photos, might be seen as really important indicators of commitment and social validation.
Like making it Facebook official.
Exactly. But conversely, in other cultural contexts, such public displays might be viewed with more reservation, or even seen as inviting unwanted public scrutiny, or perhaps seeming boastful. Similarly, cultural norms surrounding privacy, trust, and just the general appropriateness of online emotional self-disclosure can vary widely. What feels normal to share in one culture might feel deeply uncomfortable in another.
Right.
So it's just crucial to recognize that the digital control mechanisms we see in play on social media are deeply embedded within these broader sociocultural frameworks. And these frameworks ultimately shape individual experiences of intimacy and console in quite distinct ways.
So, what might be considered a totally normal or acceptable level of online sharing or even monitoring in one cultural context could be perceived very differently, maybe even negatively in another. It really underscores the importance of considering that broader cultural context. Okay, so as we try to synthesize all of this, what would you say is the primary takeaway regarding the impact of social media on emotional control within our relationships?
Well, ultimately, the impact is a really complex interplay. It's a combination of the specific technological features of the platforms we use, our own individual personality characteristics and vulnerabilities, and as we just discussed, the overarching cultural norms that guide our online behavior. It's never just one single factor determining the outcome.
Right, it's the mix. And you also highlighted some really interesting contradictions inherent in this whole digital landscape. What's the key paradox that stands out to you from our discussion?
I think the central paradox, as I see it, is this tension surrounding digital control. On one hand, these platforms offer tools that have the potential to enhance intimacy and even self-regulation, right?
Hmm.
They facilitate connection, provide avenues for support,
Yeah, the good side.
but simultaneously, they create these unprecedented opportunities for surveillance and
Oh.
exert forms of control that can fundamentally undermine the very foundation of trust within a relationship.
Hmm.
The act of monitoring a partner's online activity, which is often justified, maybe internally, as an expression of care or concern, can very easily transform into intrusive behavior that breeds discord and erodes autonomy. Navigating this delicate balance between the benefits of digital connectivity and the inherent risks of overexposure and loss of autonomy, that's really a defining challenge for modern relationships in our increasingly digital world.
That sums it up well. So, what are the major implications of all of this then? Both for researchers who study these phenomena and, for us as individuals just navigating these challenges in our daily lives.
Well, for researchers, I think there's a clear imperative for more in-depth and nuanced studies, particularly longitudinal research that tracks how these digital control mechanisms evolve over time within relationships.
Seeing how it changes.
Exactly. And also more qualitative studies that really delve into the lived experiences of individuals. How does this actually feel day to day? From a practical standpoint, there's a real need to develop more targeted interventions. These should probably integrate digital literacy education with strategies for enhancing mindfulness, maybe providing relationship counseling that specifically addresses these unique challenges posed by our digital interactions.
Tailored help.
Right. Relationship education programs, for instance, could significantly benefit from incorporating discussions about this dual impact of social media on our emotional well-being. Just raising awareness about common triggers for negative emotions, like jealousy and mistrust in the online realm, can equip individuals with more effective tools to navigate these complexities and hopefully foster healthier relationship dynamics.
This has been such an illuminating conversation, really unpacking a lot. So, to bring it all together, social media has undeniably transformed how we experience and manage our emotions within our relationships. It presents both these incredible opportunities for connection and some significant risks, particularly concerning increased jealousy and the potential for digital surveillance.
Hmm.
The impact, as you said, is multifaceted. It's deeply influenced by who we are as individuals, the specific platforms we engage with, and the broader cultural context we live in. The key takeaway, it seems, is the critical importance of cultivating digital literacy and fostering constructive, mindful online behaviors as a means of promoting healthier emotional regulation within our closest connections.
Exactly. It really boils down to developing a mindful awareness of how these digital spaces are shaping our emotional landscape, and then making conscious choices to navigate them in ways that ultimately support and strengthen rather than undermine our relationships.
So, as you go about your day, maybe listening to this, I encourage you to consider this. How might your own social media habits be subtly influencing your emotional experiences and the expectations you hold within your closest relationships? Is the constant connectivity truly enhancing your sense of control and connection, or could it be perhaps inadvertently eroding it in ways you haven't fully considered? It's definitely a question worth pondering. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.